Chapter 1 The Puppet Elves.
Verily, in ages past, ere the wool had its sway, the world was a barren and desolate place. There be those who do believe that existence did commence when the animals first did appear. Yet, no animal may live without sustenance, and so they first did take their sustenance from the vegetables. And verily, the vegetables in turn did take their sustenance from the minerals. As the minerals were the non-living foundation of all life, it doth mean that the first life was in truth the vegetables. And thus, existence in truth did commence when the first vegetable sprouted forth from the mineral known as soil. Verily, the first vegetable was the herb, which did encompass the grasses, culinaris, medicinals, and vines. From the herb, the bulb was begotten, which did encompass the true bulbs, flowers, and corms. And from the bulb, the mighty tree of the deciduous and evergreen families was begotten. Then came the produce, which did encompass the greens, starches, cruciferous, pomes, drupes, and berries. These be unique in that they were begotten from the first three, as well as from the soil, like the three. Verily, the fifth and final vegetable was the most unique of all, for it did encompass sentient plants that not only grew from the soil, but travelled above it. These be known as the living, and they included the dryads, treants, nymphs, leshes, and
us. A choir of tiny voices cried out at once to interrupt the lesson. A beautiful pair of emerald eyes looked down at the source of the shout. Nestled in the flower bed were 10 bulbs of various hues of brown with bright green stalks. Some of the larger bulbs sat cross-legged with fully developed arms and legs. The smaller ones rested on dozens of tiny roots that twitched and moved like spider legs. Big or small, all their faces had little eyes colored the hues of various greens, tiny noses, and petite mouths that were caught up in giggling. One part of herself felt humor at the outburst while the other part felt annoyed at the interruption. She neither smiled or laughed towards her charges as the will commanded and only nodded.
Aye, 'tis true, my saplings. We be the fifth among the living, begotten after the elves did discover our seed and plant it in the heart of the wood.
Deformed.
The smallest bulb spoke up.
What name doth we bear?
The deformed, for that is what she was called, cocked her head.
What meanest thou by thy words?
Marry, dryads be called dryads and treants be called treants, but what name befits our kind?
Now understanding the question, the wool gifted her the answer.
We have no names, or at least none that we have bestowed upon ourselves. We hath no need of such appellations, unlike the other races.
Wherefore is this so?
Another asked.
Names be a manner of discerning like things from one another, yet other races have need of names in their written and spoken tongues. We use not the former at all, and the latter we use but rarely, save for the instruction of impatient saplings.
Though the will did not encourage it, she smiled and pressed her index finger into the tiny stomach of the nearest bulb. This caused it to tip over onto its back, where it then flailed its limbs as it giggled. Another bulb scratched around its stalk.
I am yet confounded by this matter.
Mayhap an example wouldst aid in understanding.
The deformed looked around the grove they were in. She then pointed to the small lake on their left. The lake waters were pristine and its shore was surrounded by a series of giant mushrooms of various pastel colors.
An elf mayhap wouldst espy that lake and deem it fitting to bestow upon it a name, such as Rainbow Mushroom Lake. The elf would then recount this unto his people, and in time, all wouldst know the lake by that name, and use it whensoever they desire to speak or write of it.
She then looked back to her saplings and placed her hand over her core.
Yet, if I were to speak of that lake unto our people, I have no need to use that name. For they wouldst know that I spake of that specific lake the moment I thought of it, by virtue of our shared bond through the will.
Pray, what meanest thou by the will?
The deformed paused, for she did not fully know the answer. However, the will gifted the knowledge to her once more.
Verily, the will and our people be as one. 'Tis the very essence of our existence, the gathering of our wisdom since the first sapling sprang forth from the heart of the forest. It doth know all that we know, and we know all that it allows, for it is the collective consciousness of our people. Through it, we art connected to each other, and it doth guide us in our growth and development.
Her saplings looked at each other, their little faces thoughtful. The deformed could sense their curiosity and confusion, and so she continued,
Names be not necessary for us, for we hath no need to discern one from another. We art all connected through the will, and it is through this bond that we doth understand each other. We hath no need for names, for we art one.
Her saplings were quiet for a moment, pondering her words. Then, one of the larger bulbs spoke up.
But what of those who are not of our kind? How do we communicate with them?
We did adopt the Aranatsahin tongue after they welcomed us into the world. We use it when speaking with them and to thee, my saplings, since thou dost not fully understand the will yet. Things shall change for thee greatly once thou dost. Through the will, we can communicate with nearly all living things of the wood.
The deformed replied.
Verily, it is a language that doth transcend words and names, for it is the tongue of the forest itself. We hath no need to speak or write in the way that other races do, for we primarily communicate through our very being.
Her saplings were silent, taking in her words. The deformed could sense that they were still struggling to fully understand, but she knew that with time and experience, they would come to grasp the depth and power of their connection to the will and understand the true nature of their existence. For they were not just plants, but living beings, connected to all within the wood. She neglected to mention men, for they were too innocent to be exposed to that horror as of yet. That too would come with time.
The will doth know all that we hath been, learneth from what we be now, and foreseeth what we shall be. Thou art yet young and may not yet grasp its full meaning, but thou wilt after thy first decade beneath the light of the grand star.
She summarized, as she felt enough time had passed for their thoughts.
Wherefore must it take so long?
One of the youngest bulbs pouted as it scampered closer to her on its spindly legs. She placed her hand palm up on the ground and allowed the tiny sapling to climb into it. She then lifted it up and gently stroked its stalk with her other hand.
Forsooth, thy mind is not yet fully grown. But on a day, when thou hast bloomed into a male or female, thou shalt walk beneath the boughs and suddenly begin to hear it. 'Twill be like the whispering of the wind through the leaves, the trickling of sweet raindrops on the soil, and the kiss of the grand star piercing the canopy. 'Twill be a thing not of magic, psychic, or occult, but a pure empathetic and natural understanding. Thou shalt look upon thy people and know them, even as they know thee. Thou shalt speak less and understand more.
The bulb nuzzled its cheek against the tip of her finger.
And that shall be a thing of goodness.
The deformed paused at this. One part of herself wanted to express something that she could not describe. A feeling she had felt many times before but could never fully comprehend. She tried to puzzle out the feeling, but then her other self, as always, cut off her thoughts and made her answer.
'Tis the most wondrous thing. On that day, thou shalt know that we be one, henceforth and forevermore.
The bulb smiled as she lowered it back down to the flower bed to rejoin the others. The largest bulb, who was over a quinquennium old and stood at nearly a full meter, then asked,
"Pray, is there a way to discern our gender at present?"
"Methinks that be a shrewd query."
The deformed smiled as she spoke. She suddenly halted as the will sent her a revelation.
A visitor of the Aranatsa High Court hath arrived. It is ordained that the deformed shall confer with the esteemed individual forthwith.
The bulbs did not take note of this, for it had occurred in an instant. They only looked at each other in puzzlement as she began to speak.
"Our lessons for today are done, my saplings. We shall continue on the morrow. Go and explore, learn and play, yet within the bounds of the grove. Our people shall soon bring forth victuals for the midday repast."
The bulbs were quick to get out of the flower bed. They were more than happy to have their daily lessons end early. They wasted little time scampering and crawling for the lake to jump into play. Although they attempted to swim, their buoyant bodies caused them to mainly flail on the surface, rather than truly swim. With only a brief glance at the bulbs, the deformed rose to her feet, her articulations creaking and clattering. She knew exactly where to go, for one of her kin had already met the elven visitor, and that knowledge had been gifted to her by the will. Extending her right arm towards a nearby, low-hanging branch, she channeled the primal magic into her limb. The limb morphed and stretched into a vine, and so her fingers were able to grasp onto the branch above. With a swift pull, she was lifted into the air, her arm shortening as she neared the apex of her arc. She reached out with her other limb and repeated the spell, latching onto another nearby branch to propel herself through the wood with great speed. The elven lord waited patiently as he rested on a tuft at the top of a small, mossy hill next to the path. Patience was a virtue he had mastered over a millennium ago, though he wished his present company were more welcoming. He turned his steel-blue eyes upon the female Rashiri who stood opposite him across the Noralina trail. Within the starbeam that pierced the canopy above, she stood statuesque, as silent as when he first hailed her. Her figure was more lithe than that of a female elf, and her epidermis was smooth and colored mint green. A mantle of leaves sprouted from her shoulders, looking like feathers, with purple tulips nestled within that circled like a necklace. The long fuchsia strands of her hair, actually silky trichomes, flowed past her waist and glittered in the soft blue light of the grand star. Pointed ears nearly as long as his own poked out on each side of her lustrous mane. She was nude, but this mattered little, for she had no genitalia. She was not a creature of flesh and blood, but of pith and sap, like all of the Rashiri.
"Behold, a perfect specimen of what the will of the forest desires,"
the elven lord thought to himself as he gazed upon her.
"Although each one is a unique creation of nature, distinguished by their outward appearances, their internal essences are the same and tell a dull fable."
The lord was startled when the Rashiri flower suddenly spoke.
"Lo, she approaches. I must take my leave."
Her musical yet hollow voice stated curtly, like a flautist cut short at the start of a performance. She then vanished into the foliage that surrounded them before he could even ponder a thank you or goodbye. He knew that this was their way, but it didn't make it any less jarring. His attention was diverted as his ears caught the faint sound of movement above him. He looked upward and spied a tiny figure, flying, just below the canopy. Her presence would have gone unnoticed if not for the blessing of his people's acute senses. She landed 2 meters before him with the grace of a butterfly, the tresses of her auburn trichomes trailing behind her. A brief smile touched his lips, for he knew her, or rather knew who she used to be. The deformed stood to her full height, causing her articulations to rattle. She made no effort to mask the sound, as she had been sent to speak, not spy. The cream color of her epidermis was a stark contrast to the snow-white skin of the elven lord. However, he ironically blended into the environment more, due to the elegant forest colors and leaf patterns etched into his Iaroth armor of faux steel plates bound by spider silk cords. A pang of shame touched her core at that realization. The wool urged her not to be distracted, so she focused on his cold gaze and face mantled by his long, black hair. She had to look upwards, for he stood over a full head taller than her.
Hail and well met, my Ardamir.
She began with a greeting that acknowledged his title, as the will had guided.
Verily, it has been.
Corain such an earth,
The elf interrupted. The deformed was taken aback by this word. She looked upon him as a stranger, for she had no memory of the elf, but that word struck a chord deep within the recesses of her mind.
Prithee forgive me, my Ardamir, for I know not the meaning of that word.
She apologized, feeling her words were false the moment she spoke them. The smile that had been on the elven lord's face slipped away and was replaced by a look of sorrow.
Once again, I am but a forgotten memory to you.
The deformed figure faltered and stepped back from him. The sensation of a memory just beyond her reach was growing stronger.
Aragnon. Ardamir Aragnon.
His smile returned.
Aye, but let us dispense with formalities, old friend.
She returned the smile as the fog lifted from her mind.
By my troth, thou art the only one who doth call me by that word.
Do you recall the reason for which I address you by that name?
She paused to search her returning memories, then reached up to touch the singular rose nestled on the left side of her head among her auburn trichomes. He nodded.
Truly, it is a joy to set mine eyes upon you once more.
He stepped forward, closing the gap between them and stood alongside her.
Pray tell, how have you fared?
Indeed, all is well. As the most skilled in speech and the use of the Aranatsahan tongue, I have taken on the task of teaching the saplings.
Aragnon smirked at her words.
Truly, my memory reaches back to almost a century past, when you were but a bulb. The first time our paths crossed, you fell from a tree branch and took respite upon my hair. I had almost mistaken you for a caterpillar, until you spoke unto me.
He reached up to touch the top of his head at the memory.
Verily, my memory doth fail me.
A soft frown returned to his face.
I perceive. It is a cherished memory for me. Never before had I encountered a Rashiri so inquisitive. You would often ask me many questions.
The deformed nodded. Though she had no memory of this, her experience teaching the saplings made it seem plausible.
Such is our way when we are yet young and have not yet the capacity to comprehend the will. But once ordained, all the knowledge we need is granted us.
And all that is superfluous is removed,
the elf added in a sour tone.
Aye,
she confirmed. It was the truth. One part of her took notice of the change in his tone, but the other part deemed it unimportant. Aragnon released a sigh as the conversation continued. Even though Karenisu could still remember some things, much of what she used to know was now lost. Most of her former self had faded away, and Aragnon couldn't help but feel bitter about it.
Old friend, with your permission, let us proceed to the reason for my visit,
he said. Karenisu appeared unaware of his thoughts as she replied,
Pray tell, Aragnon, what brings thee so far into the forest?
I am relieved that she at least has dispensed with my formal title,
he thought with a faint smile.
I present to you the latest hearsay from the realm of mortals.
By this, he referred to the small part of the world outside the world wood, where all men had been banished to by the Rashiri a millennium ago. At those words, Karenisu's visage suddenly transformed. Her posture became more rigid, and her elegance dissipated. The radiance of her emerald eyes turned into an eerie, pupilless gray, and she gazed through him like one who could not see.
Speak thy tidings,
she ordered in a spectral voice. Aragnon knew that his old friend was no longer with him. She was now a vessel. Even though it was not the first time he had spoken to the collective conscience of all Rashiri, the experience still sent a chill down his spine.
Pray tell Morith Kami, do you remember the tidings of the dwarves that I conveyed a century past?
He asked.
We do,
the vessel replied.
My people have been keeping a watchful eye on these newcomers ever since they first appeared. It is highly probable that they emerged from the depths of Mount Senyaru. They had been fortifying the mountain long before adventurers, dispatched by a local guild to investigate suspicious activities, discovered them. Although attempts were made to defeat the dwarves, who were seen as invaders, they were unsuccessful. The dwarves' fortifications held strong, and many brave men lost their lives in the struggle.
Thus should be the destiny of all mankind,
the mouthpiece declared in a frigid, indifferent tone. Its gray eyes turned jet black with a solitary, malevolent gleam at their core. Aragnan recoiled at the voice. This was something he had experienced before as well. Whenever a Rashiri served as a mouthpiece for her people, it was possible for the more dominant among them to take control and speak their individual thoughts through the vessel. It was not the act itself that caught him off guard, however, but the one he knew that voice belonged to, Gorofurosu. The darkness dissipated after several fraught moments, and the vessel's eyes reverted to gray.
Proceed,
it ordered. The elven lord felt a sting of resentment at the command, but the will of the forest was one of the entities that was closest to being a god. It would be unwise to risk its ire. His people depended greatly on the bounty and sanctuary the forest provided, especially with the threat of monsters and the ever-growing dangers of men and now dwarves.
Proceed.
It repeated the directive, its tone conveying a sense of impatience despite its unyielding countenance.
According to rumors brought back by our scouts, who have overheard travelers along the high roads, the dwarves possess weapons and arms of exceptional quality, forged from a rare metal that can only be found deep in the earth. What the dwarves call this metal, I do not know, but men have given it the name true steel. It is said to cut through ordinary steel with ease, which is why they now refer to normal steel as faux steel.
He explained in the elven tongue, but used the tongue of men as needed. The vessel stayed silent with a serene countenance, but Aragnan sensed that it was listening closely. Though the will of the forest appeared to be concerned solely with the safeguarding of the world wood and its inhabitants, it also possessed an insatiable thirst for knowledge.
There is more,
it declared, rather than inquired. He continued.
By all accounts, the dwarves have started engaging in trade with the cities of men, despite the recent conflict. They seldom venture far from their mountain stronghold, but they will entertain peaceful parley with those who approach them. Strangely enough, the dwarves have taken to the tongue of men with great ease and now speak it fluently.
Aragnan felt a sense of displeasure from the vessel, though its expression was unchanged.
As per the reports of our scouts, the dwarves have little interest in wealth or riches. They do trade for certain goods such as wines, potages, produce, and meats, but it appears that their primary interest lies in acquiring knowledge and information.
Elucidate,
it commanded.
The dwarves have expressed a keen interest in what they refer to as the surface world. They crave knowledge of everything from the arts to the various philosophies and theologies. In particular, it appears that they are intrigued by the subjects of astronomy, cartography, and dungeoneering, as well as diplomacy and political theology.
And in return?
Aragnan braced himself because he was now getting to the heart of the matter.
Various resources from the depths with many that we have never seen before. These include meats from exotic beasts, produce that extends beyond mushrooms and truffles, an overabundance of sal for preservation as well as other minerals, rare and beautiful gems and metals, and even arms and armor with certain restrictions.
The vessel remained silent for a while as it processed the information.
True steel?
It queried.
That is true to some extent, but not entirely. They are willing to trade true steel arrow and spear tips, daggers, short swords, and swords in exchange for vital information. However, they have shown no interest in trading large or blunt weapons, tools, or armor unless they are made from faux steel or lesser materials.
They are allowing men to sample power, but denying them the means to attain it for themselves.
The vessel concluded. The elf lord nodded.
I.e., since the dwarves' arrival, the world of men has been plunged into chaos. The nobility and royalty are now locked in a frantic race to amass arms, seeking any advantage against their enemies and rivals. They have been recklessly acquiescing to the dwarves' demands, even if it means only gaining a few of these coveted swords. Roads have been abandoned, bandits are pillaging throughout the countryside, and entire kingdoms rise and fall in a matter of pence.
Even better,
the vessel replied, its face still devoid of expression, yet its tone suggesting pleasure at this revelation.
The dwarves are shrewd.
Indeed, they are much too crafty.
Aragnan frowned.
At present, the dwarves have made no attempt to contact any of the Ranatsoi provinces within the forest. It appears that they are satisfied with dealing solely with men.
The vessel lapsed into silence once more for a time.
You apprehend that they will eventually set their sights on the wood.
That is one possibility, and there is another to consider as well. While it's true that men can be prone to violence and foolishness, not all of them are so. There may come a time when a leader arises among them, one who can unite their people and lead them to greatness. Though their lives may be short, they have not forgotten the exile of their ancestors at your command.
The elf lord did not hold back as he made his case to the god of the ancient forest.
These wars will tax their resources, destroy much of their land, and may even pressure them to seek conquest as they did a millennium ago, especially if they fear the unknown threat more than the known. If this comes to pass, with stronger weapons and greater might, they may once again turn their gaze towards the forest and towards you, Morth Kami, their ancient adversary.
The mouthpiece's eyes once again transformed into black pools, and that voice returned.
Then they march to their ruin. Let them come. The branch and vine shall strip the flesh from their bones, and the roots will sup upon their blood.
This cannot go on any longer.
Aragnan struggled to maintain his composure in the face of the god's arrogance.
It has been 1,000 years since the war. Is that not enough?
Nay, men are avaricious and self-serving. They despoiled the land, leveling hills, filling in valleys, and felling every herb, bulb, and tree they deemed worthless. They slaughtered the creatures of the forest, then ravaged the land with the overgrowth of crops to sate their insatiable appetites. They allowed no time for the soil to lie fallow, and when their harvests failed, they cursed the land and abandoned it, leaving it so parched and barren that it took centuries to revive. And that is but a fraction of their devastation. Even now, the lands of ash have yet to recover from the conflagrations they ignited to slaughter my children.
The elven lord took a step back. Though the mouthpiece showed no physical transformation, the anger and malice in the voice reverberated through the trees, causing the starbeams around them to flicker like candles.
I grieve for your loss, but their people have also suffered, as have yours and ours. I was there, stepping over the bodies of friend, ally, and foe alike. But you cannot remain trapped in the past. You must let go of your hatred.
Never.
The mouthpiece declared icily, slashing her hand through the air to silence him.
My son toils ceaselessly to extend the Noralina trail so that men may never again exploit fire in such a manner. Even after a millennium, scarcely a third of the forest has been shielded, and all because of their accursed adventurers who meddle with his labors. They disregard their banishment and strive to pillage the ruins of their fallen cities within.
Then grant them passage to the ruins, and they shall trouble you no further.
The mouthpiece chuckled.
There will never be enough to satiate the greed of humanity. If I were to permit them unbridled access to the forest, it would only be a matter of time before they plundered the land once more. Give them one tree, and they'll set the entire forest ablaze. Nay, never again. Let them strive to reclaim their bygone glory. My children will always be prepared to obliterate them as long as my roots still cling to the earth. So it has been, and so it shall be until their complete demise or ours.
The elven lord clenched his hands into fists.
The destruction of all is inevitable if you persist on this course, Goroforo-sama. I do not ask you to forgive the sins of their forebears, but I implore you to give the present-day inhabitants an opportunity to make amends. Educate them. Share your wisdom, as our ancestors did with you countless years ago.
His words went unheard as the mouthpiece merely reiterated,
Never again.
Aragnan shook his head regretfully and unclenched his fists.
As you will it, so shall it be.
There ensued a protracted pause as the mouthpiece and elf gazed at each other. Then the black drained from its eyes and they reverted to gray.
And what do the Aranatsai seek?
The vessel inquired. The elven lord felt a sense of unease at the vessel's ability to read hearts, but he responded nonetheless.
Several troops of Orkneyhiard have invaded the Surabaya province. Though we have repelled them on numerous occasions, they keep returning in ever greater numbers. We suspect they have taken refuge somewhere in the Jairun Murido. Shina Tenaveth Kami beseeches your assistance in uncovering their nests and putting an end to the orc spawn.
The veil is profound and replete with myriad enigmas.
The vessel remarked.
Very well. We acquiesce to this compact in return for the information imparted. What quantity does he demand?
The hunt shall commence in 5 days' time and will begin downstream of the Surabaya.
Aragnan began by relaying part of the Emperor's plan.
The Tenaveth Kami seeks 2 fides of your finest trackers and 4 fides of your mightiest warriors, Morith Kami.
It shall be done,
the vessel replied before inclining its head. The lackluster gray drained from its eyes, and they reverted to the customary gleam of emerald green. Suddenly, Karanisu faltered, and her legs gave way beneath her as she collapsed to the ground, her right hand reaching up to clutch her temple. Aragnan closed the distance between them and knelt down beside her.
Old friend, are you well?
Her visage was anguished, but she assented.
I thank thee for thy solicitude.
He proffered his hand, and she acquiesced, permitting him to assist her to her feet.
I pray for thy triumph in the approaching fray.
May good fortune smile upon us and all that lies ahead,
he replied, studying her intently.
Karain Suchanaeth, what is your opinion of humankind?
Her eyes blazed with black for a brief moment, but it was her own voice that uttered the words.
They have no honor and must be vanquished.
Aragnan's visage twisted with bitterness.
Such was not always your opinion.
She withdrew her hand and pivoted away from him.
I was but a sapling then.
Without another word, her arm elongated and transformed into a vine, allowing her hand to seize a branch several meters overhead. She then swung away into the forest, rapidly vanishing from sight. After her departure, Aragnan remained silent for a while.
Farewell, dear childhood, your purity has vanished,
he lamented in his solitude. Or so he thought.
I see it did not go as you had desired.
A gentle, feminine voice spoke from behind him. The elven lord was rarely caught off guard. Drawing his folded elven blade from its sheath, he spun around out of reflex. He balked as soon as he saw the elven maiden who now looked at him with wide eyes and her hands held up palms outward.
Arashelachaneath, I instructed you to stay with our Hyrogens,
he said sternly.
I apologize, Aranyan Santhar. I assumed you would recognize my voice,
she said, taking a careful step around his sword.
You were away for so long that I began to worry.
The forest is rife with bewitchment,
he reminded her. The elder brother let out a sigh as he returned his blade to its sheath.
The meeting was delayed. The Rashiri are not ones for words, quite literally. I had to wait for their vessel to arrive.
Do you not mean Karensa Santhar?
The elven lord raised a brow.
The delay was not so significant,
he stated as he started to walk back along the trail.
For how long have you been eavesdropping?
Long enough,
Arashel responded, her tone impish as she fell in step beside her brother. She was dressed in battle attire similar to his, but her lamellar armor of leather, bound with silk cords, was built for agility rather than protection.
She was a true beauty. At first glance, I mistook her to be one of our own, save for her petite stature.
That is her curse,
he stated as they rounded the bend in the trail, revealing the sight of their mounts. The Hyrurugans panted happily upon seeing their masters and shook their curly, camouflage manes. Some observers might mistake these creatures for mere animals, but in truth, they were living vegetables of humble intelligence. A closer examination would reveal that their manes were actually made of leaves and delicate trichomes that changed colors with the passing of the seasons. Their silent, graceful movements and soft paws made them well suited for blending into their surroundings, which made them a favored choice among the elven cavalry.
What do you mean, Yurizanthar?
Arashel respectfully asked as she nimbly hopped onto the back of her mount. Aranyan, clad in his heavy armor, mounted his Hyrurigen in the traditional manner, using the stirrup and saddle horn on the left side.
Do you remember the first one I encountered after I left you?
He inquired.
Oh, you mean the one with the beautiful lavender haw?
She started to say before trailing off, her face flushing as she realized she had fallen into his trap.
If my own Aderito defies my orders, how can I expect obedience from my Sensamir?
The elven lord remarked dryly, clearly displeased.
My apologies, Artemir Sama. I did not intend to show any disrespect.
She apologized, addressing him properly as her lord after being called little sister. Aranyan murmured a quiet command to their mounts. Without needing a touch of the reins, both Hyrurugans bounded off down the trail. The trail was 5 meters wide and allowed the beasts to run side by side with some comfort. It was easy to tell it was an unnatural trail, as there were no trees obstructing the way and it was well maintained. The only foliage along the path was grass and wildflowers. Occasionally, they would pass ancient shrines of toppled stone or withered trees that marked the sites where a great fire had raged centuries ago.
Well?
Arashel prompted after a while had passed. He cast a sidelong glance in her direction, but ultimately relented, realizing that the information she was about to receive was crucial for her to know.
The will of the forest, which is their divine patron, governs every aspect of the Rashiri's existence, from sprouting to withering. Its true nature remains a mystery, but it is very discerning in choosing which traits it allows the Rashiri to inherit. The one you saw earlier is deemed acceptable by the Morith Kami. However, the latter one, whom I call Karain Suchanaeth, is not. In fact, she is regarded as the deformed one among her people.
With her long, dark tresses trailing behind her, she regarded her brother quizzically.
In what way is she considered deformed?
From the perspective of their divine patron, everything.
He scowled.
Our archives indicate that the Rashiri were once almost identical to their Ranatsoi. Some even believe that we share a common ancestry, although this contradicts other ancient records.
I am familiar with some of the records you mention, but my knowledge does not match yours, Artemir Sama. However, what is your point?
Aragnan did not respond immediately as they reached the point where they would need to leave the trail and begin their journey back to his province. With a quick command to their mounts, the Hierurugians slowed from a gallop to a trot as they ventured off the Noralina. Their destination was the hidden elven highroad that would lead them back home, but the ancient forest had a way of confounding even the most seasoned travelers. The elven lord knew that even they were not immune to the forest's treacherous twists and turns, and as they rode deeper into the woods, the towering trees closed in around them, obscuring their path and threatening to lead them astray.
Over time, our two clans grew apart. The reasons for this are a subject of much debate and speculation among our historians. However, they concur that the Rashiri began to resemble beings of flowers and trees, rather than our own people. Some say this was due to pacts made with the wood spirits of the Fae, such as the Treants and Dryads. Others believe it was a natural consequence of their environment or the passage of time. Regardless of the cause, those who underwent the transformation were deemed worthy of admiration for their beauty and fecundity. Those who did not were looked down upon and unlikely to find partners.
Alas,
His sister mourned.
it appears that it was a case of survival of the strongest.
The way of nature and the will of their divine patron.
He spoke with solemnity and a hint of irony as the pair entered the forest and disappeared from view, knowing that the trials ahead would be as treacherous and unpredictable as the wilderness around them.
Karain Suchanayath is descended from an ancient lineage and may well be,